So yes, good morning. So today's session in the virtual conference, we've got Catherine Corrick. We're having an in-conversation session with Catherine. Catherine is the Development Strategy Director at Icebreaker One, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. Catherine's also was Head of Learning and Content at the Open Data Institute. She was Online Manager for New Statesman until 2006, and is also part of a consultancy of Corrick Wales and Partners, where looking at learning and content there. So she's got quite a broad background, broad sort of interest in data and open data in particular. So welcome, Catherine.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me, Julian. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning.
That's good. And just a quick question, a reminder for the audience, if you've got a question for Catherine, please use the Q&A box in the Zoom interface. If there's a question somebody else has asked that you would quite like to hear an answer to, by all means upvote that question, and I will pick them off as they come through as appropriate. So first off, Catherine, just interested really in terms of what was it that actually got you into a career in data?
You know, as we were talking before, Julian, I'm not ever sure I have a career in data, but it seems that that's kind of happened along the way. I'm sure many of your viewers remember the Commodore 64 and BASIC back in the 80s, and definitely I was one of those people, and a bit of learning HTML and using Netscape Navigator, again, for those who remember that. But really, my interest it was sort of sparked when I was working at the New Statesman, and we used to run what was called our New Statesman New Media Awards at the time, where, you know, in the early 2000s, when all this world was called new media, it wasn't even called, you know, digital or so. And the purpose of those New Media Awards was to highlight, and it was interesting around, you know, the BCS is all for good for society, but the New Media Awards are all about trying to highlight what good work was being done for society, democracy and government on the web. And at that time, all sorts of new things were going on. I don't know if any of you remember My Society, who is still an excellent organization looking at how data can improve, otherwise can improve government, as well as our local government and things like that. And so a lot of the ideas that we now understand as open data were being sort of, there's a cauldron happening in those early 2000s. And the ideas around, again, like for government were coming through and poking through and how we can improve them. And so at that time, that's where my interest in particular around data and open data was sparked. But you know, if that sort of answers your question initially, and how we and who was doing that work, and what was very, very exciting time, I think. And a lot of the players now that were doing things then are, you know, you see them all over the place now at GDS, which is the Government Digital Services, you see them at the BBC, you see them in all sorts of new innovative startups as well, which at the time there's just a small number of us. You're on mute, Julian.
Thank you. Good reminder. Age-old problem in this stage, really. Yeah. So it's sometimes interesting that sometimes we feel that we're actually living in a very big world, but actually sometimes these worlds, these communities are quite small, and you see the same people, same organisations coming around time and again. One interesting thing. So we mentioned there about Icebreaker One. I mean, can you just explain a little bit more about what Icebreaker One's objectives are and what your role is? Because clearly that's an area that might well be of interest to a lot of people.
Sure. And I think it connects back actually to what I was just saying. Where we're at now is that Icebreaker One is trying to create a web of net zero. So all the data that can help us solve and achieve net zero is what we're trying to put together. Now, when had you talked to me about the web back in those late 90s, early 2000s, it was definitely a web of content, but now we're at a phase of the web of data, and there's so many different ways to point that out. But the importance of data now to make decisions in different ways, and to get metrics, we can't, organizations now can no longer just rely on the data they have themselves. They have to be collaborating with other organizations and using other people's data to be able to make decisions and even do their own work, which I think we'll come on to later. But that's what Icebreaker 1 is trying to do, and create that web of net zero. And our initial work has been in insurance, energy, the finance area, and transport. But that's, and I was interested to see that you were talking to Anita Payne and Ofwat, because water is a significant part of us achieving net zero as well. So, you know, that's in one of our clusters that we have in mind.
Yeah, so it's interesting there in terms of there's a lot of things that are working together, but some interesting challenges that we can probably touch on the challenges a bit later. But what do you think the successes are and how the world of open data has moved on? Because part of the reason for the subject for the conference was the fact it's 10 years since the ODI was formed. It's now time to sort of reflect on that. So what's your perspective on the successes and what's been achieved?
I think when I was brought in to the Open Data Institute to set up their learning and training programs, and because I'd done a lot of work in training and learning and as part of my work before joining the ODI, and to set up sort of, well, what will that look like? And at that time, I don't know how many of you know, but Southampton University was part of how the ODI got set up. And so they came with a very academic perspective of what was needed. Now, it's not that that wasn't required, but actually most people who needed at that time to be thinking about open data were in the workplace, were in government. They needed something they didn't need academia necessarily. They needed, what do I do today, tomorrow, and the next day? And what is this stuff called open data? I don't really know. And so what we set up was like day courses. We also did set up a week course, but it was that was where we're at. People didn't really know what open data was. There wasn't really training. There wasn't really any very much understanding beyond a small group of people. Whereas now, you know, open data is something that is being discussed in lots and lots of different areas beyond government. And I think that is the significant difference. And it is an international movement, which happened quite quickly and was already sort of there in sort of 2012, 2013, but it is international. It's not just about the UK wanting this, it's part of a bigger movement.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So you mentioned also there in terms of, and you kind of alluded to this, of this isn't really a technology problem. This is much more about people and changing attitudes, changing beliefs. I mean, any thoughts there about trying to correct any misconceptions maybe?
I mean, yes, obviously there's technology involved, obviously, but really this is a cultural shift. And openness, whilst there are some challenges to be aware of when you know thinking about open data, not all data should be made open, but it is a cultural shift. And it's not just about the brilliant data scientists that may be in your organization. It's, well, how do we think about our approach to information, our approach as an organization? It requires collaboration, both internally and externally. We have to be thinking about data governance, so the law, how we license things. There are so many different aspects, but most importantly, what do we want to do with it? How do we want to, going back again to your slide, how do we want this to make a difference to society? What do we want to deliver to make people's lives better and to make society better? Now, that isn't something that you can just do by looking at a keyboard or learning coding. You have to think about what is society, what are the problems that we're facing. And so there's so many disciplines needed if we are to use open data to its full extent.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier there about sort of ingesting and bringing in data from outside the organization, but also there's a counter argument of getting organizations to recognize there's actually potentially a benefit to the society as a whole of sharing some of their data that is relevant, that is suitable for sharing as open data. Again, are there any thoughts about how you actually make organizations realize that there's actually a wider benefit in doing this?
In which aspect? Sorry,
about sharing some of their data as open data.
I think we're definitely seeing that at Icebreaker 1, because for a lot to achieve some very specific goals for net zero, and I'm sure there's many other examples I could use, but for me, net zero is what I'm focusing on at the moment. Organizations cannot rely just on the data they have, but also they cannot rely on another organization who they're working with to have the information. So we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment around electric vehicles and electric vehicle charge point planning. Now that sounds incredibly niche, but if you would, 30% of households in the UK cannot access a charge point because they don't have a garage, they maybe live in a block of flats or whatever it may be. So they're reliant on on-street charging. Now, to plan on-street charging, you need local authorities, you need the district network operators who are the energy, you need the charge point operators, and they all need to be sharing information to be able to do the planning and the rollout, because government has set some quite some very ambitious but good targets for charge point rollout, so that you can actually charge your vehicle. So that it's absolutely a necessity. It's not even an option to be sharing data to make these things happen and in benefit to your organization.
And I think in that example you've given there, it's one where the right solution has to be a multi-organizational approach. You have to bring in the data from different parties. So you can't just look for a piece of land that you assume would be good to put a charging point on. You can't just look for where in the network. You've got to bring together all those different ideas, because it's a multifaceted challenge, really.
Yeah, and also because of the energy required as well, the shift in energy usage and the increase in energy requirements and electricity in particular, that requires itself to know, can we cope with this as a sort of as a network, as a country? And similar things are happening as well with heat pumps, that we've got some targets too for housing and shifting the transition away from gas. And that, again, is a huge societal change from infrastructure, culturally, energy-wise, and again, requires that systems thinking and collaboration between multiple parties to make it happen, including, right down to, well, what does that architecture look like? How do I know whether there's going to be enough energy for that house to be able to put this in? What does that look like? So it's a very exciting time for open data and data sharing for practical purposes.
Yeah, and I think going back to John Murray's session on Wednesday, when he was talking, he'd been doing some work with the University of Liverpool where they were using LiDAR data of residential areas and then using that to interpret it to try and identify where are the trees, where is the high-rise properties, where are the Victorian sort of terraced areas. So using that as a basis to try and categorize property types. And again, that fits very neatly into what you mentioned there about net zero, about understanding insulation requirements and energy demand and heat pump suitability and things like that. So yeah, another one of these very complex, multifaceted questions. Yeah, so there's a question come through from Lisa, and you mentioned there about making sort of IT good for society. She's actually asked the question there of, well, what would you define as society? Sort of, how do you actually fit it? I know it's a very big philosophical question, isn't it? But let's give it a go, shall we?
Right. Well, I did my degree was in originally in theology, philosophy, and ethics, and how you think about society and community. Now, if you study sociology, there are, I don't know how many definitions with the word community alone, but for me, I think, try not to undermine any academic principles here. Society is the people that, it's people and how people work. It's people, it's the people and a groups of people. Beyond that, I would have to go and reference proper societal definitions. But yes, it's how we live together and how we work and achieve things together as a society.
Yeah, so it's very much about the people element rather than just saying, oh, it's a load of buildings or highways or whatever. that in fact the enablers, the containers, but it's the people that becomes the society. That's it.
Yeah, and how those people work and communicate and do things together. Yes.
Yes, because we don't want to get to an environment where sort of everybody's trying to do it on their own, which will, a different topic. We'll go on to that another day, maybe. What are your thoughts though about maybe just changing tack very slightly in terms of we can make it data open, we can make it available to many other people. What about thinking about maybe and getting some cautions there about the potential adverse consequences of maybe using data for ill, you revealing something that you might not want to reveal, or maybe it should be revealed but you might feel uncomfortable about it. It's just thinking through about some of the downsides or some of the other aspects around open data.
The first thing I'd say is open data should never be, or very rarely should it be, personal data unless it's aggregated to a high degree. And I would reference the work of the Office for National Statistics, and there's some really good, if you want to sort of figure out how to do anonymized data properly, them, and I think there's UK Anon as well, who give advice on how you anonymize data so that it cannot reveal and be de-anonymized. So I just want to get that out of the way first of all. That does not mean to say that it sort of happens, but let's just put that one to one side for now. I think that then this is a huge question, and not just about security, but also it can come into national security, believe it or not. So one of the things we've been doing a lot around energy data now in the current circumstances with the war in Ukraine occurring. I think this would be probably more obvious than perhaps it would have been if I'd said this a year or so ago. But our energy strategy and data around our energy systems, there is a degree to which some of them are of national security level. And how that's managed, or for a whole load of different reasons, even just how much gas we may have, through to where locations are for specific things and how we manage stuff. So there's certain things for national security and other security reasons we may not want to reveal, or may want to have strict controls over, a bit like we would have strict controls around personal data. But then we sort of go through, and there's other bits of data that perhaps have other concerns around, maybe commercial concerns. There may be some things where actually, yes, that actually shouldn't be in the public. And so for all of this, because a lot of our work in Icebreaker One isn't just to do with open data, it's to do with shared data and how to increase sharing of data within organizations. For some of those reasons I was explaining, we've put together what are called data sensitivity classes. Now, let me just, I'll find a link so so people can go on to it. We've got a lot of part of our work is around documentation and helping. We've got a trust framework so that data can be shared in a trusted way. So I'm going to first of all put a link to everyone for that. Oops, just one second. Sorry, I've only got one screen. I apologize to everyone now. So this is first of all our documentation around our trust framework. And our trust framework is to help the sharing of data that can't really be shared as open data. And then specifically, where we got them, we've got sensitivity classes, which those classes then help us sort of go, and then the zero class, if you like, is open data, where it's like, yeah, that's fine. Whereas other data, here we go, here's our sensitivity classes. It then sort of goes up in degrees of sensitivity. I'll just pop that link in there as well. Just to give you a quick example, we've got a table there. At the bottom, you'll see 0 or O, which is open data. And then right at the top there, we've got closed data, which is, data that should only be within the organization. Now, to kind of just complement that slightly, we've got, so it's very clear when I'm talking about open, shared, and closed, I just think it might be useful for you all to just see this diagram here. which is just the data spectrum.
Mm.
And what the data spectrum shows is sort of, well, what open data is, which is data with an open license that can be used for anything for any purpose. Shared data is where we'd have a preemptive license, so it might limit the purpose, or it might limit the use, and then closed data would have a license. Well, it's very unlikely to have a license, but it might have a bilateral license, so it's just agreed between two parties. So just if that helps with some of the issues that might come up, there's lots.
Oh yeah, no, I mean that's really interesting, because that actually plays back to Alex's presentation yesterday. So I think if it is an area that people have got an interest in, I'd recommend looking at both ISO 19650 Part 5 and also on the CPNI, that's the Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure website. They've got a framework and a document there about trying to step people through the process about deciding whether this is data that can be shared, whether it can be open or not, or whether it's restricting the kind of controls you have to put in place. But getting back onto the energy side of things, one of the conversations I'd had with somebody a number of years ago was talking about the North Sea oil and gas sector, was the fact that there were issues around sharing information. They wanted to share, but they're all clearly concerned about the commercial sensitivity of what was sharing. And they finally had a breakthrough moment, this is a little while ago, where they realized, actually, if we can classify things the same way, and at least get the same data structures, when we have a need to share, we then can share in a way where we actually understand what we're talking about, but that's handled by a separate thing. So in terms of just thinking about separating out the structures, so we've got a potential for interoperability with the actuality of saying, actually, I want to share information with this organization. We're happy with that. We've got the controls in place. Now let's go and do it. Any thoughts about trying to overcome those potential blockers and those very restrictive mindsets, maybe?
I think this is, let's just say, I think this is normal. This is very, very normal, and will be the most prevalent view in most organizations for lots and lots of different reasons, coming back to that culture that I was talking about earlier, because we've generally got a culture within an organization that is you're being employed by the organization for the organization, and you tend to be the culture within organizations is to protect the organization. And so when that's queried, which is what open data begins to do, it's like, oh, this is scary for lots of reasons, and some of which is, what if our data is not very good? Or what if someone queries the quality? Or what if or they use it and a mistake happens? Or or it's in a terrible format, or oh my goodness, it's actually, we use legacy systems because and we've had to tape them together with glue and string and bits of Python, and so we don't, we sort of culturally can get quite defensive about that. And so I would say the first thing to think about is, well, let's try and tackle the culture first, and not necessarily there are technical issues, but generally speaking, there is always someone who can be a data intermediary. So if you've got like what you think is terrible, messy data, there is someone who will just love to make it neat and tidy, and they'll go, bring it on. Oh, you're using that, you mentioned Fortran. It's like, oh, you're still using Fortran, huh? Just a minute, or COBOL, okay, well, whatever it may be, there's people who just love to make things better. So, yes, it helps if this stuff is interoperable in the first place. Yes, it really helps if there are agreed standards around the metadata and fields, but there is also people who just love being that intermediary to make things better, so that then so it can be then used, and they profit from doing so. So I think there's so many fears in this area, but the one around quality is the one I think that comes up most, and it's the one actually that holds back most organizations from sharing data. Because they worry too much about perhaps the wrong things, rather than thinking about, I'm sorry if I'm banging on this, but it's for the data consumer to decide whether they can use that data. And so perhaps you want to make sure that it's very clear the state of the data that you're providing. but don't, as long as you're making that clear, it's like, yeah, this is not great, but you know what, you're welcome to it. But if you use it for X, Y, Z, don't come back to us if it doesn't work, but and so just making it very, very clear what state the data is in, rather than trying to make it perfect. It's never going to be perfect, ever.
No, and that gets onto a whole different topic, which we'll save for another day maybe. But actually, it does actually very neatly go back to a point that Tim, who's on the call today, he will regularly reminds people of quality is conformance to requirements, and it may well be that an open data set that's been published was developed based on a certain set of requirements. But if your requirements are different, then your perception of the quality of that data will have changed. So part of it is then understanding about, well, what were the requirements? What was this constructed? And therefore, how well does it meet our needs? But actually, it also leads into another question from Lisa, who is sort of thinking on the net zero side. There's a lot of naturally evolving metrics that can help organizations understand and manage their data. But then thinking about that level of when it's maybe a bit speculative and you're not quite sure, before you get to the spectrum where it's now robust or it's now fit for publishing. It's interesting, there's a continuum there. Any thoughts about organizations? Should they publish early with a caveat and saying this is still very experimental, we're not quite sure about? Any thoughts about where they get the voice? Is it good enough to publish? And then people might have missed a boat somewhere.
I think the thing that I'd be most concerned about is actually not whether it's good enough to publish from a point of view of quality, but is there anything in that data that is actually accidentally sensitive? So the checks should be, have we, and I've seen this in a number of times where it's like, is there email field in there? Check the fields, not necessarily the quality of those fields, but check the fields and actually do some checks around what data is in there that may accidentally not be. So quite often when I'm looking at a data set, it's like, oh, why is this telephone number in the I don't know, the notes field? It could be anything, right? But there's do those sorts of checks, definitely. But I think to make sure that there isn't data that shouldn't be in there, that would be my base, but others might disagree, but that's the bare minimum. And I would be encouraging people then to publish the data early rather than late, because more eyes on the data can then quickly say, you've accidentally published a whole load of emails. Oh, right, okay, well, let's just quickly amend that. Rather than waiting for it to be perfect. And that is a lot of effort and actually may not be useful, because what you think is useful, actually going back to what you were just saying just now, we didn't need this bit to be useful. We just needed this bit over here to work, because the data consumer knows what they need rather than you presuming that you know what they need.
Yeah, so and I think also linked to that, and Tim's raised a point, there's an interesting question there about provenance. So if we're publishing this data, if it's data that is in a very rare situation where it's been entirely created and curated by the organization that's doing the publishing, that's fine. You can say, this is our data, we stand by it. But probably the likelihood is there's going to be many situations where you're actually bringing in data from different sources. You as an organization have done some level of aggregation. And so how do you actually maybe think about how do you explain the provenance again so people can properly understand how they might use that data?
That's such a fantastic question. And I think the first thing to know is, well, what was the license terms for the data that you are using from other organizations? Because that may determine whether it can or can't be made open data in the first place. So yes, when there's multiple sources, first of all, check the license. If, and I think it would be rarely, if those licenses are all the open data licenses, then I think you've got then to state, as should be in the license terms, the sources of the data. So it's about transparency and not assuming that people will just know, or that they can then reuse that data themselves. So I think yes, definitely looking at the provenance of that data is very, very important, but the licensing of it, and then from there, understanding what you can and can't then do with that data and how you have to explain it to others. And there's very few licenses where, I mean, the government open data license is actually incredibly flexible and incredibly open, but most will have some kind of terms in there, like maybe a share alike or something like that, which will require you to make sure it's clear what other people can do with that data.
Yeah, and actually that gets in neatly to Martin's raised an interesting question. So he's wanted to know whether you think the 2015 regulations on the reuse of government information is making a difference to the amount of government information being released through OGL.
You know what, Martin, I'd love to give an opinion on that, but you may be more up on it than me. And so I'm not going to even try and answer that question satisfactorily without having to go and properly look up what those regulations say and how it's impacted. Brilliant question. I do not feel as though I am able to answer it satisfactorily.
Okay, fair enough. Wasn't trying to put you on the spot
no,
there.
No. It's a great question. I don't feel it's above my pay grade right now without doing more research.
Fair enough. Anyway, okay, changing tack very slightly. I mean, in terms of what do you think about sort of awareness of the exec, the C-suite of organizations, so their awareness of open data and trying to make sure they're actually properly embracing it rather than it being open data in name only? Maybe we've got a tick box. Yes, we've published one data set, tick, we're doing open data. Any thoughts about how to both what C-suite attitudes are like and how to maybe move them into a better place?
I think this has been a question right from the get-go, and I don't know what Nigel, your conversation with Nigel right at the beginning of the week, and whether you raised this with him, and I'm sure he would have, said some similar things. But in government, there is very high awareness within different government departments and good practice and guidelines around what to do. Beyond government, I think what we're beginning to see is regulators now, like Ofgem. I know one. I think you were talking to Ofwat. I think they're also looking at these issues too. So what we're seeing is now from the regulator, then they are making people aware, and organisations, private organisations or public PLCs, aware of what they would like the data environment to be, for which there are some language being used, like the Ofgem use the word presumed open, so they don't necessarily say the word open data, they use the phrase presumed open. So the language is sort of filtering down. It's sort of from government regulators to then the C-suite, if you like, because it's then a requirement. And then we have sort of some exceptions to that where there is higher awareness of open data at a C-suite level, but it's not something, I think they'd be more likely to be aware of data protection issues. And as someone, so the partnership that I run is actually all about data protection. And even then, I think that's execs, they'll have a finance person or people on their board, but they're less at the moment, and they might have a tech person, but we're beginning to see data people at a board level, but that's still something quite new. And we're beginning to see CDO positions as well as CTO or CIO positions, but it's still at that. Data is still, and this is data, not just open data, just data generally, is still a new thing at a sort of C-suite level, and how to think about it. So yeah, I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think it's still, there's quite a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah, so I think it's getting there. I mean, and part of it is there could be areas where there's a defined benefit for the organization to opening up some of the data. But potentially some of it is a bit more like corporate social responsibility, where actually by doing this, it's more of an altruistic act to make something available for others to exploit and use better.
Maybe. I'm not even convinced by that. I think it's, and maybe if that's happening, it's because they're not maybe aware of what the definition of open data really is. So for me, open data is data that can be used by anyone for free with a license, so that it's clear what they can and can't do. When it doesn't have a license, which often occurs, and I'll come back to that in a second, then it's unclear what someone can then do with that data, as we were discussing before. And so they can't then reuse it for something which might be those lovely, good for society stuff. So, but there is a lot of data that is publicly available that is free and for others to use for any purpose, but I would not consider that to be open data. And I think there may be within what you're talking about is data that we've made available for free, that perhaps isn't that a nice thing, but I would not describe that, strictly speaking, as open data.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess in terms of the licensing, you as an organization publishing it, you need to think, well, both what is the license as appropriate, but also think about the likely uses for that data. And you probably have to think a little bit wider than your core things, because people are very innovative, aren't they?
Absolutely. And we were having exactly that conversation with an organization about 2 weeks ago. It's like they have published some open data. They're very excited about it. And they want people to use it. It's like, great. It's like, okay, so what can it be used for? And so the part of our approach at Icebreaker One is looking at use cases, so that it's like, rather than thinking, oh, it's just some data, it could be used for anything. It's like, no, really, what is the problem here? And then what data can be used to solve that problem? And is any of that data open? Or should it be made open? Or should it be made shareable? So that you can actually pinpoint the problem to the data, rather than often, here's some data, can we try and solve a problem with it? Which, I mean, there's two ways of it. It's not that that's a wrong approach. It's just two ways to sort of try and solve something.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I think there's a question that's also popped up recently is also just thinking about sort of assurance mechanisms for open and shared data. Do we actually need a little bit more assurance to understand the genesis of the data and how much we can rely on it, but also the mechanisms, the feedback loop? So this has been published, but we think we might have spotted an issue with it. What about the routes to try and, any thoughts there about sort of trying to improve the assurance?
So again, funnily enough, we're writing some recommendations for an organisation yesterday, in fact, and one of those things was exactly that point: is create mechanisms for feedback for lots of reasons, but mostly so you're understanding the problems with the data so that you can improve it. And going back to my point again earlier on, it's allowing the consumers to be pointing things out to you rather than you trying to think through how it should be.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, absolutely, on the mechanisms point, I think that's really, really important. However, I would argue that should be the case for all data if you're sharing it with another organization, be it on a bilateral license or anything else, because data is not perfect. And it has problems, and you need to know about them, particularly if you're making money from that data. But you need to know about that and create those mechanisms, whether it's open or not.
Yes, indeed. And the idea about data can never be perfect. And that's one of the things I talk about quite a bit, is trying to get people to adopt a carpenter's mindset, where a carpenter will look at a piece of wood, work out what's the grain of the wood, are there any knots, so I can work out how best to use it. I think similarly, people need to take similar approaches with the data. But arguably, some of our colleagues who might have a more analytical head or a data sciencey type head sometimes get carried away with how many million rows of data they've got, and they don't necessarily stop to think, actually, how much of it is good, how much of it should we filter out? I mean, do you see that with some of your technology colleagues?
Oh, I would never say that. But you have hit a bugbear of mine, and I studied statistics back in the day, and I would recommend anyone doing basic statistics, whether you're at C-suite, whether you're a data scientist, whether you are anyone doing a basic statistics course, because what you learn there is data isn't perfect, but you learn also what you can and can't do with it, how to think about data and information. And again, if anyone is thinking, what should I do in my next step as in my career, even if it's in law, I'd say go do a course in statistics. Just learn the difference between the mode, the median, and just to understand these things, because that way you can then see, well, sure, it was however million lines of data, but it was inputted by people from without any accuracy, and there was no checks on the data entry whatsoever, and so actually it's rubbish, absolute rubbish.
Yeah. But I think that also gets into about how you present the results of any analysis, of whether, so for example, somebody saying a number to 5 decimal places will kind of assume that therefore it must be extremely accurate. And it might just be they've forgotten to trim it, they've forgotten to put, so that presentation of the outputs, presentation of analysis is really, really key to how people ingest it and use it the right way.
Absolutely. And I've worked as we discuss in journalism, and it's also how you read something. So when someone presents information to you, you are more able to query it in a way that's like, oh, okay, and so I think if I'm the person, when they say, should you do data science or statistics, if you had to choose, I say, go do statistics, then go and do some data science, but not the other way. Yes, okay, if you're a data scientist, please go do some statistics. You can do it both ways, but
Yeah, Tim's put in the chat there a recommendation of a book, How to Lie with Statistics. Yeah. So again, if you're interested in that could well be an interesting read for somebody. Anyway, changing tack a little bit, and this is, we had a conversation yesterday, and Lisa's raised the question there about whether we're trying to create a shared database. I think the answer is no, we're not trying to create one shared database, but I think there is a question there about just the sheer volume of data sets, what they represent, how you maybe navigate and understand what's out there. Any thoughts about how we can actually either organize or make sense of this growing open data environment that we've got?
That's a gift of a question, and I did notice earlier around that database aspects, and it's like, really, no, that's for us. If you go to Open Energy, this actually illustrates what you're asking. Let me just give you a link so you can all have a look, and I can talk you through it. In fact, it's always nice. I'll try and do a live demo, which is a bit dangerous, but let's give it a go to illustrate this point. So I've just all given you a link to openenergy.org.uk. And what I'd like you to do is maybe just click on, I don't know, EV, and there's, rather than try and think of a search term for now, just click on EV. And what will happen when you click on EV, I'm seeing Western Power Distribution at the top there, and then Bristol City Council. What it's listing is data sets. It's not, we don't store any of the data sets here, but what we're trying to do is make it much, much easier to find data sets relating to a particular area. And because we come from this use case approach, we're also then trying to sort of do it through our use cases and encourage publishers where possible to then publish that data. So to answer your question, how do you find it? And also, is it about a database? It's like, no, but what we have put together is metadata standards for how you describe the data so that it's much more easy to find. So a bit like, really, although it does more than Google, but a bit like everyone is quite familiar with how to describe their web page, so it can be optimized for search for Google. This is a similar thing. It's optimizing how you describe your data set so that it can be found by as many people as possible. But going back to what we were saying earlier, it's also, well, how can this be applied? So putting some tags in there. So this is relevant to EVs. This might be relevant to air source heat pumps or whatever it might be. So I'll try and see if I've got the metadata documentation there. 1 second. So you can, for those of you who are interested, they can actually have a look at the metadata. It's actually fairly simple at the moment, documentation, but guidance for data providers, I think.
Is that on the Open Energy
side? Yeah, if you just go to the documentation, I'll just try and find a link for everyone so that, because there's a few options, data set metadata, there we go. But what we have discovered, myself and my colleague Frank, we've been looking at how we bring in lots of data catalogs and list them, because there's some amazing work being done, obviously, by the London Data Store, the government's own data.gov.uk, but there's also European equivalents as well. And so what we're currently doing is reviewing, well, with these catalogs, for which, if anyone who is on listening in from the London Data Store, love it. It is brilliantly done. Thank you very much. So much so, we're just wanting, obviously, the data sets to do with net zero. And so we're trying to figure out, well, what else should we be adding to our metadata descriptions so that we can more easily inhale and accurately inhale these really rather large data catalogs in a useful way, so that we don't end up inhaling the whole catalog, for which there's lots of useless information. Data.gov.uk, I'm looking at you, for at least for our purposes. But then, and so it's trying to, so we will be developing over time our metadata kind of standards around that, just for those who might be interested.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So again, exploring something slightly different. So clearly open data has been around a while, and it will be around for quite a while. Any thoughts about, if somebody maybe has got a bit of an idea about, well, maybe actually this is something that I could get more passionate about, maybe get a career in open data? What is there such thing as a career in open data? If somebody wants to sort of get more into this, any thoughts about routes to get there and get employed that way?
So, as you probably all gathered, I am not the traditional, what people might think of as an open data or a data person. And when Julian and I were initially, when Julian sort of initially asked me to do this, I was like, but I'm not, I don't feel as though I'm a classic computer science trained person. Yes, I have my statistics. Yes, I've got my basic in HTML, but really it's very minor. So I think the main thing, first of all, is that you do not have to be a computer scientist or have trained in computer science to be part of these changes that are happening culturally around data within an organization. There are some definite routes, particularly in legal ones. I've mentioned already licensing quite a few times, but the contracts and thinking through how data can be used by another organization, I think, is a really, really interesting one, and does require more than just law. It requires thinking about, well, understanding what can and can't be done with the data, but also thinking through the long-term impacts of that as well. Then I think there's a lot of interesting work being done as well, and thinking through systems, processes. How do you even create data in the first place? What is that, on what for? So this isn't quite answering your question directly, Julian, but I think I wouldn't say there's open data is a career. I think data, there's a lot of now, most careers will have some element of data in them. And so it's thinking through, how does your current work need to understand data, and what do you need to do to be understanding how data may apply to your work, be it in law, be it in processes, be it in your data entry, be it in your customer services, because pretty much now every job will have some element of data. And then it's thinking through, well, what may then apply to be open data, or what should never be open data within this role, and how does that then benefit our organization? I don't know if that answers your question directly, or
I think it does. I think it basically says how broad it all is. And I think also there's a lot around the people side, and we mentioned right at the start of the conversation. And I think there's an element also of the storytelling. It's not just about taking lots of raw data, doing some analysis, getting a number that's the answer. You have to be able to then contextualize that, make it, use it to tell a story, to actually not just tell that story, but actually maybe either change behaviors, help people make a decision. So there's a whole strand of doing that, getting it right.
It's multidisciplinary, and I think to get good uses of data is a multidisciplinary thing. It needs a lot of different people, and even just assessing whether something is good or bad quality. Well, you can have quality can be on many different measures of quality. Is it just consistent? Even if but it could be consistent but actually poor information. And so to be able to assess that, a data scientist might be able to tell you if it's consistent, but you might need a subject matter specialist to know if it's good information. Yeah,
and there's a whole extra debate there, and people who know me well realize I could talk at great length about that, but that's a subject for another day. We'll save that for another day. So part of the premise for this was the fact that it's 10 years since the ODI was formed, the Open Data Institute. Any thoughts from you in terms of where open data might be 10 years from now, looking 10 years ahead potentially?
Oh gosh.
Will it still be a thing, or will it just be so normalized?
I think it's still, I don't know. I think these things are very hard to predict. What I can say is that we are having this conversation 10 years later after the ODI was formed, and we would not probably have had this conversation 2 years after it had been formed. So open data has now reached a point where it is a wider common concern than when we started. And I would have thought that will continue, although you never know with these things, particularly in the current global and political environment, where we're seeing question marks actually over democracy and openness and open approaches and threats to that. So I would not want to predict that it's always a straight trajectory to a good future. I think what we are seeing though is that spectrum is improving. So where we're seeing how it's much clearer to people what data should be open and what data should be perhaps shared because it needs some controls over it, and what data should never be shared or open. So I think that's where I do see there's a shift. And of course I would say that because that's partly what our organization is doing, but it's partly because we've seen a gap between closed and multiple licenses that are really, really complicated and expensive to manage, and this sort of open where actually maybe there isn't the data there yet, or people question it for all the reasons that we've been sort of discussing.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, that one. And probably getting towards the end here, and there's a question from Tim, which we could sort of open things up a little bit. He was suggesting building on your philosophical views, and an area about trying to work out the difference between Big Brother and open data, and arguably, is open data the counter to Big Brother monitoring by the state, or if there was a state doing such things? Are we democratizing things more by making it open?
What a fantastic question. I'd have to think about that quite. I think that there's dangers both ways, and from I was reading this week about what's going on in China and the increased amount of surveillance, which, you know, is a very surveilled country, and that is carrying on, that is increasing. And the use of AI and data, obviously, that has been used to create these models for the surveillance state. Hence, data, you know, personal data, in my view, should never be put into the open in that way. So I don't know. I don't think there's a yes or a no answer to Tim's question, because I think it's something we always have to watch, and it is an ongoing. The UK, just to go into sort of data protection law, the UK and some of its laws are queried more, particularly around immigration, and what it does with data around immigration by the EU. And so there, you know, there's how we use data for societal good is something we always have to watch. I don't think there is a particular open data means that we won't get a surveillance state. I think it's more, how do we make sure that open data isn't used to create a surveillance state?
Yeah, so there's a lot of behavioral aspects there to worry about. So anyway, just a closing question. So it's been a really interesting conversation. Sort of closing question really is in terms of what would you see as just sort of the high point, the greatest success in your career, sort of in this space around open data?
I don't know. I think if it's purely around open data, the training that we did that I mentioned right at the beginning, taking this from being an academic subject to something that people can do every day and that they can immediately apply to the work, and that we made that international very, very quickly, is definitely a high point. And that there is people now who are training others in open data around the world. And you know, I'm not going to claim all the credit for that, but I think there's that shift in helping others to help others, and the fact that we are now having this conversation and that there is a wider awareness of open data, I think that is a success. And also, I'm just thoroughly enjoying the work that I'm currently doing at Icebreaker One, because it's genuinely not just open data in the abstract, but making a difference so we can achieve some really big, huge goals for society in the world today.
So that was really, really good. So it's actually about, making that bigger difference to society as a whole. So that's really good. So time's about up. So thank you, Catherine. That's been a really interesting, really stimulating conversation. Thank you for various audience questions we've had coming in. Just a quick reminder, the recording of this will go up onto the BCS member group's YouTube channel, probably in a couple of weeks when there's a little chopping and tailing and editing for it there. But on behalf of all of you, just like to thank Catherine for her time this morning. It's been a very enjoyable and stimulating conversation. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.